Claire stood at the will reading, her voice sharp as a blade, and declared, "Eleanor gets nothing from Thomas's $75 million estate." The room froze. My breath caught, like someone had punched the air out of me. The lawyer's smirk, sly and knowing, lingered in the corner of my eye, hinting at something hidden, something wrong. I sat there, hands trembling in my lap, surrounded by polished oak and the faint scent of Charleston's salty breeze drifting through an open window. For 45 years, I'd been Thomas's rock, his wife, his confidant, his nurse through every chemo session, every sleepless night. I'd held his hand when he couldn't lift it, whispered stories of our life when his voice failed. And now Claire, his daughter-in-law, acted like I was a ghost, erased from the legacy we built. That smirk, though, it wasn't just cruelty. It was a clue, a crack in her perfect mask. Our home in Charleston, with its creaking porch and shelves of Thomas's dog-eared novels, still held his presence. The air smelled of his pipe tobacco, faint but stubborn, clinging to the walls. I walked through the rooms we'd filled with laughter, with late-night talks about dreams bigger than ourselves. Thomas wasn't just a man with money, he was a dreamer, a philanthropist who poured his heart into this city's future. We'd built a foundation together, funding schools, scholarships, second chances for kids who had none. But that day, in that sterile law firm downtown, Claire rewrote our story. She didn't just take the money, she took our history. I stood alone on the porch after the funeral, the ocean's hum mixing with the clink of half-empty wine glasses left by guests. No one offered me a ride home. Not even Claire, who'd orchestrated every detail, the lilies, the slideshow, the monogrammed napkins like a director staging a play I wasn't cast in. It was flawless, cold, timed to the second. Thomas would have hated it. He'd always said funerals should be raw, messy, full of bad jokes and honest tears. This felt like a corporate event, not a goodbye. I wanted to scream, to shatter the silence, but my voice stayed locked inside me. Then Claire handed me a small velvet box. "Thomas wanted you to have this," she said, her eyes barely meeting mine. Inside were his cufflinks, silver, plain, not even his favorites. No note, no words, just cold metal in my palm. We'd written letters to each other for decades, tucked into books, slipped under pillows. But this was an insult, a dismissal. I clutched those cufflinks, my fingers tracing their edges, and felt something shift. A memory flickered. Thomas, frail in his hospital bed, gripping my wrist. "Don't let her rewrite us," he'd whispered, his voice barely there. I hadn't understood then. Now, I did. That night, alone in our kitchen, the oak table scarred from years of family dinners. I stared at the cufflinks under the dim glow of a single bulb. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest. I'd given everything to Thomas, to our life, and now I was a stranger in it. But that whisper, that smirk, that cold box in my hand, they weren't the end. They were the beginning. I've learned grief can make you feel invisible, but it's the moment you choose to fight that you find your voice. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The days after the funeral dragged like a slow tide pulling at Charleston's shore. I wandered through our home, past Thomas's fishing rods leaning against the wall, their lines tangled like my thoughts. The air still carried his scent pipe tobacco, mixed with the salt of the harbor breeze. Every corner held him the jazz records stacked by the fireplace, the armchair where he'd read poetry aloud, his voice warm as the low-country sun. But now, Those memories felt like relics in a museum I wasn't allowed to touch. Claire had swept in, her efficiency razor sharp, turning Thomas's goodbye into a performance. The funeral was a masterpiece of control white lilies in perfect rows, a slideshow timed to music, not a napkin out of place. It wasn't mourning. It was a statement, a claim on his legacy. And I was left on the outside. Looking in, I stood in the kitchen, clutching a mug of tea gone cold, staring at the cufflinks Claire had handed me. They sat on the counter, glinting under the light, mocking me. No note, no explanation, just those cold silver pieces, like they were supposed to sum up 45 years of love. I wanted to believe it was grief clouding Claire's judgment, that she didn't mean to erase me. But then I remembered her eyes at the will reading, steady, unyielding, like she'd rehearsed this moment. I sank into a chair, the wood creaking under me, and felt the house shift. It wasn't mine anymore. My name, my place, my story. It was all slipping away, rewritten by someone who'd never sat up with Thomas through the pain, never held him when the chemo left him shaking. That evening, I walked into Thomas's study, drawn by instinct, not plan. The room smelled of old books and pine, the desk cluttered with his journals, pens, a half-finished crossword. I opened a drawer, my hands moving before my mind caught up. Under a stack of faded receipts, I found a manila folder, no label, no date. My heart thudded as I opened it. Inside was a draft will, Thomas's handwriting shaky but unmistakable. My name was there, clear as day. To my wife, Eleanor Brooks, I leave my personal assets, our home, and co-trustee rights to the foundation. But a red pen had slashed through it, a single word scrawled in the margin, "Discuss with Claire." My breath caught. He'd had doubts. He'd written, "Claire insists on changes." I don't know why. I can't tell Eleanor yet. The words burned into me. He'd known something was wrong, but he hadn't told me. Why, later that night, I stood by the window, the Charleston harbor glinting under the moon. The folder lay open on the desk, its pages heavy with truth I wasn't ready to face. Then I heard a faint buzz from the living room. Claire's voice, sharp, on a call she thought was private. I crept closer, heart pounding, and caught her words through the cracked door. "We need to move the assets before she notices. It's cleaner this way." My blood ran cold. This wasn't grief or oversight. This was a plan. I backed away, clutching the folder, my mind racing. I've learned sometimes the smallest things, a cufflink, a scribbled note, carry the weight of a lifetime of trust. And when that trust breaks, it's not just pain, it's a call to act. I slipped the folder into a lockbox under the stairs, my hands steady now. Claire thought she'd written me out, but I was just starting to write myself back in. The Charleston morning was heavy with mist, the kind that clings to the cobblestone streets and muffles the world. I sat at my kitchen table, the manila folder open before me, Thomas's shaky handwriting staring back like a ghost. My tea steamed untouched, the harbor's distant gulls crying through the open window. Claire's words from last night echoed in my head. Move the assets before she notices. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was awake, alert, and I needed answers. I couldn't do this alone. I picked up the phone, my fingers hesitating over the numbers, then dialed James Whitaker, Thomas's old friend and a retired attorney who'd always felt like family. His voice was steady when he answered, but I heard the surprise beneath it. "Eleanor, it's been too long." What's wrong? I told him, everything, the will, the folder, Claire's cold dismissal. He didn't interrupt. just listened, the way he always did when Thomas needed counsel. "Meet me tomorrow," he said. "Bring the folder." The next day, I stepped into a small cafe off King Street, its walls lined with low-country art, the air thick with the scent of fresh biscuits and coffee. James sat in a corner booth, his coat damp from the drizzle, his eyes sharp despite the years. I slid the folder across the table, my hands trembling just a little. He read in silence, his brow furrowing at the red-slashed lines. The note about Claire. "This isn't right," he said, his voice low, firm. "These witness signatures, I don't know these names. Thomas always used people he trusted, neighbors, friends from the yacht club, strangers signing his will. That's a red flag." He leaned back, tapping the table. "We need someone who knows probate inside out. I know just the person." That afternoon, we met Margaret Hayes at her office, a narrow brick building tucked between Charleston's historic homes. Margaret was all business, mid-50s, her eyes like steel, cutting through the folder's pages with precision. "This isn't just sloppy," she said, circling a date on the revised will. "It's constructed. The signatures were notarized on a Sunday night, but the firm's security logs show no one entered the building. And this digital timestamp, it's been altered to look older." My heart raced. Constructed. The word landed like a stone. Claire hadn't just taken advantage of Thomas's illness, she'd engineered this. Margaret looked at me, her voice softening. "We can dig deeper, Eleanor, but it won't be easy. Are you ready?" I nodded, my hands steady now. "I've been ready since she said I get nothing." We planned our next steps over coffee that tasted like determination. James would request certified copies of the will from the county, cross-checking them against Thomas's notes. Margaret would investigate the witnesses, starting with their credentials. I'd keep quiet, keep everything as it was. No hint to Claire that I was moving. As I left the cafe, the Charleston air felt sharper, the palmetto trees swaying like they were whispering encouragement. I've learned trusting the right people can turn a whisper of doubt into a roar of truth. Back home, I tucked the folder into the lockbox, its weight a promise. Claire thought she'd buried my story, but I was digging it up, page by page, and I wasn't stopping until the truth was in the light. The Charleston sky hung low, gray clouds pressing against the harbor like a warning. I sat in Thomas's study, the folder's pages spread across the desk, each word in his shaky handwriting a silent plea. The cufflinks glinted nearby, a reminder of Claire's cold dismissal. My fingers traced the red ink, slashing my name, the note that read, "Discuss with Claire." I couldn't shake the ache of Thomas keeping this from me, his silence heavier than the grief. But Claire's voice from that overheard call, "Move the assets before she notices," burned hotter. This wasn't a mistake. It was a theft, not just of money, but of everything we'd built. I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. I opened Thomas's old leather planner, its pages worn from years of his careful notes. A name caught my eye, penciled in with a double circle: Mark Evans, tax consultant, Tuesday, 3 months ago. My heart sank. Thomas had met him during chemo, when I was always by his side, except when Claire took over. Why hadn't he told me? I called James Whitaker, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. "Mark Evans." Thomas saw him. Claire canceled the meeting later. "Can you find out why James didn't hesitate?" "I'm on it. Eleanor, stay sharp." That afternoon, James called back, his tone urgent but calm. Mark had met Thomas at a quiet Charleston diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like home. Thomas looked frail, barely able to hold a pen, but he'd asked about protecting my future housing. healthcare, my role in the foundation. Mark suggested an independent review to lock in those protections, but Thomas seemed hesitant, saying, "Claire's handling it." A week later, Claire called Mark, her voice clipped, canceling further meetings. "Thomas doesn't need your services anymore." She'd said. Mark kept his notes, though, and sent them to James. They weren't binding, but they showed Thomas's doubts, his intent to shield me. It was a crack in Claire's armor. Then the letter arrived, delivered to my porch in a crisp envelope. No return address. Claire's attorney, all polished threats, accused me of grief-driven interference with the estate. Withdraw my inquiries within 10 days, or they'd pursue legal costs. My hands shook as I read it, not from fear, but from fury. Claire wasn't just erasing me, she was daring me to fight back. I folded the letter, set it beside my cold coffee, and felt something new ignite. I've learned betrayal stings most when it comes from family, but it also sharpens your resolve. That night, I rummaged through Thomas's desk again, desperate for anything I'd missed. Tucked behind a stack of old tax forms, I found a sealed envelope, his handwriting faint on the front. For Eleanor. My breath caught. Inside was a letter, written in his final days, each word trembling on the page. "Ellie, I'm scared Claire's pushing too hard. She says it's for the foundation, but I don't trust her. I wanted to protect you, always. If I failed, I'm sorry. Don't let her take our story." Tears blurred the ink, but the words were a fire in my chest. Thomas had known. He'd tried to warn me. I slipped the letter into the lockbox with the folder, my hands steady now. Claire thought she'd outplayed me, but she didn't know I was holding her king. I called James, my voice low, certain. "We've got her. Let's keep digging." The Charleston night hummed outside, the palmettos whispering. I wasn't just fighting for money, I was fighting for us. The Charleston night glittered with the kind of elegance only money can buy. The country club's ballroom glowed, chandeliers casting light across polished wood floors, the air thick with jasmine and the clink of champagne glasses. Claire had planned this gala to honor Thomas, but it felt like a coronation. Her navy suit crisp, her smile a perfect mask as she greeted Charleston's elite. I stood at the edge of the room, my silk blouse, Thomas's gift from our 35th anniversary, soft against my skin. A silver oak tree pin glinting on my collar. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady, clutching a slim folder with Sarah Collins's deposition, the damning proof of Claire's forged signatures. Tonight wasn't about shouting. It was about presence, about refusing to be erased. I'd received the gala invitation in a cream envelope, slipped under my door like an afterthought. No call, no personal note, just Claire's name embossed in gold, claiming Thomas's legacy. The room buzzed with familiar faces, board members, old friends, people who'd shared crab boils and laughter at our home. Yet no one met my eyes for long, their smiles polite, fleeting. Claire moved through the crowd, her head tilted like a queen, every gesture calculated. A display table showcased Thomas's favorite things for auction, a signed baseball, a vintage pen, the first edition novel I'd given him, its spine worn from his hands. My name wasn't on the labels. She'd taken them from our home, my home, without a word. I took a breath, the harbor's salty tang faint through the open windows, and stepped toward the table. My fingers brushed the novel's cover, a memory of Thomas reading it aloud under the oaks. A man approached, a former partner of Thomas's, his voice kind but cautious. "Eleanor, how's the estate going? Made any changes to the fund?" I froze, my chest tightening. He thought I was still trustee. I was removed, I said softly. His face shifted confusion, then discomfort. He stepped back, mumbling an apology. That moment crystallized it. Claire hadn't told the truth. Not to everyone. Not about the will. Not about me. Claire's voice cut through the room, thanking the crowd for honoring Thomas's vision. Then she turned to me, her smile tight. Eleanor stood by Thomas in the early years, and with her grace, I carry it forward. Her grace. Like I'd bowed out. Like I'd handed her my life. The room clapped, but I felt the air shift, heavy with lies. I reached into my bag, pulled out the folder Sarah's sworn statement, metadata proof. Thomas's letter, and passed it to the man beside me, Thomas's oldest friend on the board. His eyes widened, but he took it, passing it to the next person, then the next. The folder moved silently, like a current, as Claire's smile faltered. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The truth doesn't need my voice to speak, I said, my voice low, steady, cutting through the hum. I turned, my steps measured, and walked out, the Charleston night cool against my face. The folder was a spark, and I'd lit the flame. I've learned sometimes the loudest statement is the one you make without raising your voice. Claire expected me to fade, to disappear into grief. But I'd shown up, not with anger, but with truth. And it was stronger than her lies. As I drove home, the city's lights blurred, the harbor whispering. The tide was turning, and I was no longer a ghost. The Charleston dawn broke soft, painting the harbor in hues of pink and gold. I sat on my porch, the air cool, the scent of marsh grass mingling with my coffee's warmth. The folder I'd passed at the gala had done its work. Silent, but unstoppable, like a tide shifting beneath the surface. Sarah Collins's deposition, her clear, careful words about Claire's forged signatures had reached the board. The metadata. The Sunday night timestamps when no one was in the office. The absence of Thomas's presence. It was all there. Undeniable. I didn't need to shout or beg. The truth was enough. And it was unraveling Claire's carefully woven story. By mid-morning, James Whitaker called, his voice lighter than I'd heard in weeks. The board had postponed Claire's appointment as executive of the foundation. Her lawyer, once so quick with threats, had gone silent. No more polished letters landing on my doorstep. Then came the news I hadn't dared hope for. Claire was withdrawing entirely, stepping down from her role. Her statement was brief, sent to the board in a sterile email, claiming she wanted to preserve Thomas's legacy and avoid further conflict. I read it twice, the words cold, hollow, like her smile at the gala. No admission of guilt, no apology, just a retreat, swift and calculated. I walked to a quiet park near the Battery, the palmettos swaying, their fronds whispering against the breeze. A board member, one of Thomas's old friends, had called me late last night, his voice heavy with regret. We should have seen it sooner. Eleanor, he said, there were signs her rush to move funds, the way she sidelined you. I'm sorry. His words didn't erase the pain, but they anchored me, a reminder that I hadn't imagined the betrayal. I sat on a bench, watching gulls wheel over the water, and felt a weight lift, not all at once, but enough to breathe easier. The foundation wasn't fully mine again, not yet. But Claire's grip was broken. Sarah's courage had been the key, her deposition, her quiet note, 7:43 p.m. Sunday, witnessed signature for Claire. No Thomas present had cracked the facade. She'd risked her job, her stability, to speak up, and I'd never forget that. I closed my eyes, the harbor's rhythm steadying me. I've learned truth doesn't always win loudly, but it always wins eventually, carried by those brave enough to speak it. Claire had expected me to fade, to let her rewrite our story. But I'd stood in that ballroom, past that folder, and the ripple was still spreading, back home. I opened Thomas's letter again, his words soft on the page. Don't let her take our story. I folded it carefully, placing it beside his cufflinks on the mantel. The house felt different now, not haunted, but alive, its walls holding our history, untainted. Charleston's light poured through the windows, warm, forgiving. I wasn't just Thomas's widow. I was Eleanor, the woman who'd fought for what was ours. And I was still here, standing tall. The Charleston sun spilled across my porch, warming the weathered boards where Thomas and I used to sit, watching the harbor's tides. I held a box of his papers, old grant proposals, notes on scholarships, the foundation's first charter, scribbled with his dreams. Claire's withdrawal had left a quiet in its wake, like the hush after a storm. The board's decision to pause her appointment wasn't just a victory, it was a door opening, a chance to reclaim what we'd built. I drove to the community center we'd funded years ago, its brick walls bright against blooming azaleas. Kids laughed on the playground, their voices carrying over the marsh. I walked inside, past a faded plaque, in honor of those who plant for a future they may never see. Thomas's words, etched in stone, still standing. I spent the morning archiving his documents, each page a piece of our shared vision. His handwriting danced across the margins, notes about mentoring kids, funding art programs, giving second chances. I found a letter from a young scholar, Maya, who'd received our first grant. She wrote, "Your foundation changed my life. Mrs. Brooks, I'm teaching now, passing it on." My eyes stung, but I smiled. This was why we'd fought not for money, but for this, for lives touched, for futures planted. I called James Whitaker, asking him to store the papers properly, not buried in legal files, but preserved as history. It's what Thomas would have wanted. I said, my voice steady, certain. That afternoon, I got a call from the Foundation's interim committee. They were reviewing Thomas's early scholarship program and needed guidance. I agreed to help, not as a trustee, but as a witness to his vision. At their small office, I sat with board members who'd known us in the early days, their faces warm, unguarded. "We need to get this right, Eleanor," one said. "For Thomas." I nodded, flipping through his old files, pointing out the programs he'd loved most. It wasn't about power, it was about memory, about ensuring his heart stayed in the work. Later, I stood before a small crowd at a foundation event, my hands steady on the podium, Thomas's oak tree pin glinting on my collar. I spoke of his dream education for every child, no matter their start. The room listened, not to a widow, but to Eleanor, the woman who'd carried that dream beside him. Applause followed, soft but real. I've learned legacy isn't about titles or wealth. It's about the lives you touch, the seeds you plant that bloom long after you're gone. As I drove home, Charleston's oaks arched overhead, their branches whispering. The house welcomed me back, its walls no longer heavy, but full of love, of history, of us. I lit a candle, its glow warm against the dusk, and felt Thomas's presence, not as a ghost, but as a promise kept. I wasn't just reclaiming his legacy, I was reclaiming mine. The Charleston Battery stretched before me, its cobblestone path kissed by the morning tide, waves lapping soft against the seawall. I walked slowly, the air crisp, carrying the tang of salt and marsh grass. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp in the quiet dawn. My hands rested in my coat pockets, Thomas's oak tree pin still on my collar, a steady weight against my heart. The fight was over, Claire's withdrawal, the board's pause, Sarah's brave testimony. They'd all carved a path back to the truth. I wasn't erased anymore. I was Eleanor Brooks, whole, rooted, home in the story Thomas and I had built. The harbor shimmered, reflecting a sky wide open. Mine again. Back home, I lit a candle in the kitchen, its flame dancing against the dusk. On the counter sat a photo of us in Maine, laughing, wind-tangled, free. I traced the frame, my fingers lingering on Thomas's smile. The house no longer felt like a stranger's. It was ours again, filled with the creak of the porch, the hum of jazz records, the echo of our late-night talks. I'd started a scholarship in Thomas's name, a fund for kids like Maya, to carry his dream forward. It wasn't about undoing Claire's betrayal. It was about building, about planting seeds for a future I might not see. The foundation's work continued, steadier now, guided by people who remembered Thomas's heart, not just his wealth. I sat by the window, a cup of tea warming my hands, and let the silence settle. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of memory, of clarity, of peace. I'd walked through grief, through betrayal, and come out standing. Not with anger, but with truth. I've learned a few things along the way. Lessons carved from this fight, ones you can carry too. First, speak your truth. Even when your voice shakes, even when it feels like no one's listening, it's the only way to rewrite your story. Second, trust your instincts. If something feels off, dig deeper. Your gut knows before your heart does. Third, build your support. Find your James, your Margaret, your Sarah people who see your worth and fight beside you. And finally, honor your legacy. Protect what matters, not for revenge, but for integrity, for the love that built it. The Charleston night closed in, soft and cool, the harbor's rhythm steady outside. I looked at the candle, its light unwavering, and thought of Thomas, of Sarah's quiet bravery, of the board members who'd finally seen the truth. I thought of myself, not the woman silenced at the will reading, but the one who'd stood in that ballroom, passed that folder, and refused to disappear. I was home now, not just in this house, but in my story. If you've ever had to fight for your place, your voice, your truth, know this: you're not alone. The quietest victories, the ones fought with steady hands and open hearts, are the ones that last. I stepped outside, the stars bright above the palmettos, and breathed deep. I was whole. I was enough.